in a city in Judah, somewhere around the year 605 before Christ, a man whose name we know only as Habakkuk picked up his stylus and began to write. 3 short chapters, fewer than 50 verses in total. And in those few pages, he did something that no other prophet in the Hebrew Bible quite does. He argued with God. Other prophets received a word and delivered it. They were channels. Habakkuk refused to be a channel. He had seen too much, and he would not relay any oracle from on high until on high explained itself. The opening of his book, in chapter 1 verses 2 and 3 reads, "How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen, or cry out to you, violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing?" That is how the book begins. Not a sermon to the people, a complaint pressed against God himself. From the first line, the prophet is not on God's side or on the people's side. He is standing between them, pulling on both. What he was looking at, in that summer or autumn of around 605 before Christ, was a kingdom collapsing under its own weight, and on the road from the north, an army already in motion. None of it had built itself in a day. It had been building for almost 2 decades. To see what he was seeing, we have to start where it began. On the lower Euphrates, in the year 626 before Christ. In that year, in a city on the lower Euphrates, a Babylonian general named Nabopolassar refused to take any further orders from Nineveh. Assyria had ruled the ancient Near East for the better part of 2 centuries. Its armies had taken Samaria, broken Damascus, broken Egypt, made vassals out of every kingdom from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. Now its great king Ashurbanipal was dead, his successors weak, the empire fraying. Nabopolassar declared himself king of Babylon and stopped sending tribute north. For about 15 years afterward, the old empire and the new dynasty fought each other across Mesopotamia. The Medes joined the Babylonian side from the east. City by city, the centers of Assyrian power began to fall. Ashur, the religious capital, fell in 614 before Christ. Nineveh, the political capital, the city Jonah had once been told to preach against, fell in 612. The Babylonian Chronicle, the document that keeps year-by-year accounts of these events on cuneiform tablets, records the fall in plain terms. The city was taken. The king Sin-Sharishkun perished. Nineveh became a heap of ruins. What Assyrian rule had meant for the kingdoms that had been under it is hard to overstate. Their kings had perfected a kind of bureaucratic terror, the deportation of conquered peoples to break their identity, the public mutilation of captured rebels, the carved reliefs in their palaces showing piles of severed heads and impaled bodies as official decoration. The prophet Nahum, writing roughly in this same generation, says of Nineveh in chapter 3 verse 1, "Woe to the city of blood, full of lies, full of plunder, never without victims." For many in the ancient Near East, the fall of Nineveh felt less like the changing of one empire for another, and more like the end of an old order of fear. 3 years later, in 609 before Christ, the last Assyrian remnant tried to make a final stand at Haran in the upper Euphrates. They had one ally left, Egypt. Pharaoh Necho II, who saw a strong Assyria as a useful buffer against the rising power of Babylon, marched north from Egypt with his army to reinforce them. And on the way, he passed through the territory of Judah. In Judah, on the throne, sat a king named Josiah. Josiah had become king at the age of 8, after his father Amon was assassinated in his own palace by his servants. He was now 39 years old, and he had spent more than half of his reign undoing the religious damage of his predecessors. His grandfather Manasseh had reigned for 55 years, the longest of any king of Judah, and had reversed the reforms of his own father Hezekiah piece by piece. He had set up altars to foreign gods inside the temple itself. He had reintroduced child sacrifice in the valley of Hinnom. And in the words of 2 Kings chapter 21, verse 16, he had shed so much innocent blood that he filled Jerusalem from end to end. The kingdom Josiah inherited at the age of 8 was an inheritance of ruin. According to 2 Kings chapter 22 verse 8, in the 18th year of Josiah's reign, that is around 622 before Christ, the high priest Hilkiah was supervising repairs in the temple in Jerusalem when his workmen brought him a scroll. Hilkiah recognized it. He sent it to the king, and when the words of the scroll were read aloud to Josiah, the text says in 2 Kings chapter 22 verse 11, when the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his robes. What followed was the most thoroughgoing religious reform in the history of the southern kingdom. Josiah purged Jerusalem of foreign cult objects. He broke down the Asherah pole that stood inside the temple of the Lord. He defiled Topheth, the place in the valley of Hinnom, where children had been burned in the fire to the god Molech. He removed the horses dedicated to the sun by the kings of Judah, and he burned the chariots of the sun. He pulled down the quarters of the male shrine prostitutes that stood within the temple precincts. The list runs for almost the entire length of 2 Kings chapter 23. None of these things had been small. They had grown up over generations. Josiah took a single year, and they were gone. Then, in the summer of 609 before Christ, Pharaoh Necho came north along the coast road, on his way to reinforce the last Assyrian remnant at Haran. Josiah took an army out to intercept him at Megiddo, the strategic pass through the Carmel Range that had been the gateway between Egypt and the north for over 1,000 years. Why he did this is not fully clear. The text in 2 Chronicles chapter 35 verses 20 to 22 says that Necho had sent messengers warning Josiah not to oppose him, that he was on errand from God himself, and that Josiah should stand aside. Josiah would not listen. He disguised himself and rode into the battle. An Egyptian archer drew his bow at random, and Josiah was hit. According to 2 Chronicles chapter 35, verse 23, the wounded king turned to his officers and said, "Take me away! I am badly wounded." He was carried back to Jerusalem, and he died there. The chronicler records, in 2 Chronicles chapter 35 verse 24, he was buried in the tombs of his ancestors, and all Judah and Jerusalem mourned for him. The same chapter mentions, in verse 25, that Jeremiah composed laments for Josiah, and that to this day all the male and female singers still commemorate him in the laments. Josiah's death was not only a political event, it became a national grief, set to music, sung for generations afterward. Josiah was succeeded by his son Jehoahaz. The text in 2 Kings chapter 23, verse 31 says he was 23 years old and reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. 3 months. Pharaoh Necho dethroned him on his way back from his campaign in the north, took him in chains down to Egypt, and exacted from Judah a heavy tribute. In his place, Necho installed another son of Josiah, Eliakim, and gave him the throne name Jehoiakim. From that moment, Judah was a vassal kingdom, first to Egypt, and within a few years to Babylon. Jehoiakim was not his father. The reform Josiah had built was held together by personal commitment as much as by institutional weight. And once Josiah was gone, the institutional weight was not enough. The high places that had been torn down began to be rebuilt quietly. The cult of the Queen of Heaven returned to the streets of Jerusalem. Idolatry returned to the temple courts. The prophet Jeremiah, active in this same generation, describes Jehoiakim in chapter 22, verse 17, in language hard to soften. But your eyes and your heart are set only on dishonest gain, on shedding innocent blood, and on oppression and extortion. The courts failed. The strong took from the weak. The poor were not heard. The reform of Josiah, the great hope of his generation, looked from inside its own collapse like an interruption rather than a turning point, something that had happened briefly and then ended. Habakkuk was not the only voice in this generation. Jeremiah was already active, walking the streets of Jerusalem with his lamentations. Nahum had recently sung the fall of Nineveh in 3 short chapters. Zephaniah, perhaps an older contemporary, had warned Judah of a great day of the Lord. Daniel, a young man, would within the next few years be carried away to Babylon. The kingdom did not lack prophets in the years of its unraveling. What it lacked was ears. This was the world Habakkuk was inside when he picked up his stylus. He had seen the law paralyzed. He had seen justice perverted. He had seen the wicked closing in on the righteous. He had asked the Lord how long, and the silence until now had been long. But somewhere on the road that ran north from Babylon along the Euphrates, an army was already moving. The son of Nabopolassar, a general soon to be the most consequential king of his century, was drawing closer. The prophet did not yet know that the answer to his cry would arrive on horseback. It came in the spring of 605 before Christ, on a plain by the Euphrates called Carchemish. Nabopolassar's son, the crown prince of Babylon, was about 30 years old. His name was Nebuchadnezzar. In Akkadian, Nabuchodonosor, Nabu protect my heir, and he had been sent north by his father to handle what was left of the Egyptian and Assyrian alliance. The Egyptian army was under Necho II, the same pharaoh whose horsemen had passed through Megiddo 4 years earlier. The Assyrian remnant had been pushed back to Carchemish, the strategic crossing point where the Euphrates bends out of Anatolia and into the Syrian plain. There the alliance made its stand, with the river behind them and the Babylonian army coming up the western bank. The battle is one of the most decisive in the history of the ancient Near East. The Babylonian Chronicle, the same cuneiform record that had described the fall of Nineveh, narrates it in clipped military language. The crown prince crossed the river. The Egyptian forces gave way. The defeated were pursued and cut down. The chronicle says, all the way to the Egyptian frontier, none escaping. In a single campaigning season, the political map of the Levant was redrawn. The Egyptian army was destroyed so completely that Necho lost not only his current campaign, but his ability to project power east of his own border for a generation. Carchemish was the moment Egypt stopped being a great power of the ancient Near East. It would not seriously contest the Levant again until centuries later, and the man who had ended Egypt's reach was technically not yet a king. For the kingdoms of the southern Levant, the news of the battle was a hinge in time. For 3 generations, those kingdoms had calibrated their foreign policy around the rivalry of Egypt and Assyria, choosing between them or playing them off. Now, there was no Assyria, there was Babylon. The world had become smaller and the choices had narrowed. In hindsight, Carchemish marks the close of one age and the opening of another. The chain of dominant empires that had run from Sumer through Akkad through Assyria was now reduced to a single inheritor. The prophet Jeremiah would compose, in chapter 46 verses 2 to 12 of his book, an oracle specifically on the battle, a poem on the rout at the river, on the swift cavalry that could not flee, on the bodies of the slain falling among themselves. Word of his father's death reached Nebuchadnezzar on his march south through Syria. The crown was vacant, and other claimants, brothers, generals, palace factions, could decide the succession in his absence. He dropped the campaign. He left the heavy infantry to follow at normal pace and crossed the Syrian desert with a light escort, racing the news back to the capital. He arrived in Babylon, the Chronicle records, on the 15th day of the month of Elul. The next day, the 1st of Tishri, he sat on the throne. He would reign for 43 years, longer than almost any other king in Babylon's history. And he would shape the next century of the ancient Near East. Under the new dynasty, the city itself was being rebuilt on a scale that was meant to advertise the New World Order. The Etemenanke Ziggurat, the temple tower at the heart of Babylon, was being repaired. The processional way of Marduk was repaved in glazed brick. The Ishtar Gate, which the next century would know as the most splendid entrance of any city in the world, was being commissioned. To the kingdoms now paying tribute, the message of all this construction was clear. The age of Nineveh was over. The age of Babylon had begun. The next year, in 604 before Christ, Nebuchadnezzar marched west again. This was no longer a campaign against an enemy. It was a tour of imposition. The kingdoms of the Levant had to choose a side, and the side was Babylon. Damascus submitted. The Phoenician coastal cities submitted. The Philistine cities submitted, with one exception. Ashkelon tried to resist. Its king was killed, its leading citizens deported, and the city, the Babylonian Chronicle records, was reduced to a heap of ruins. The destruction of Ashkelon was thorough. The burn layer from 604 has been excavated in modern times. Buildings collapsed under intense fire, bodies sealed in rubble, the city's temple complex razed. Among the Philistine cities, Ashkelon became the cautionary tale told to the others. None resisted afterward. In Jerusalem, on the throne, sat Jehoiakim. He had been Egypt's vassal. He now became Babylon's. The prophet Jeremiah, who dated his message that year as the 4th of Jehoiakim and the 1st of Nebuchadnezzar, set out the consequence in chapter 25, verse 11, in language that would echo through the centuries. This whole country will become a desolate wasteland, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. A first wave of Judahite hostages was taken, back to Babylon in this period, treasures from the temple, sons of the noble houses. The book of Daniel opens with that wave. Who exactly were these people? The ones now collecting tribute from every kingdom between Egypt and the Iranian plateau. In Hebrew, the word for them is Kasdim. In Akkadian, Kaldu. The Chaldeans had originally been a tribal confederation in the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia, near the Persian Gulf. For more than a century before Nabopolassar, they had been a recurring source of resistance against Assyrian rule, never quite extinguished, never quite acknowledged as legitimate. Nabopolassar himself had been a Chaldean by lineage. When he seized the city of Babylon and declared independence, what he was doing was, in part, a tribal vindication. The dynasty he founded would be remembered as the rulers of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and Babylon would, under them, reach a scale unmatched in its long history. There was something else about the Chaldeans beyond their armies. They were also heirs to a tradition of priestly astronomy older than any other in the ancient world. The Temple of Marduk in Babylon kept star catalogues going back generations. By the end of the following century, the word Chaldean would, in Greek and Aramaic alike, come to mean simply astrologer, a Babylonian priest learned in the sky, able to read what the gods had written there. To the kingdoms paying tribute under Nebuchadnezzar, the Chaldeans were not just an army, they were a civilization that had seen empires fall and risen as their interpreter. But the prophet in Judah was not looking at any of this. He was looking at the army. Babylonian forces of the late 7th century were fast, mobile, and disciplined in a way the world had not quite seen at that scale before. They moved heavy cavalry across distances that would once have required staged supply. They built siege ramps quickly and burned cities methodically. Their record of dealing with rebellion was the same record Assyria had pioneered, only sharper and more administrative. Where Assyrian kings had publicly mutilated rebel leaders for the propaganda value, the Babylonian kings deported entire elites and replaced them with administrators of their own choosing. The terror was less theatrical and more systematic. It came as paperwork, with horses behind it, the methods that the prophet of Judah would put down in writing. In the verses of his book that follow the opening complaint, read like a clinical description of these forces. Cavalry leaping over mountains, horsemen swifter than leopards, cities scooped up like dust into a siege ramp, kings mocked, fortresses laughed at. The Lord's answer to the prophet's first cry was not abstract. It was a specific army with specific tactics, already collecting tribute from every kingdom under heaven. That was what was rising. That was what stood between the prophet's first complaint and any answer he might receive. The Lord, in his hearing, would soon name them by their own name: Kasdim, Chaldeans. And the prophet of Judah, who had cried for justice and asked how long, would find that the answer he was given was not a comfort. It was that army, those Chaldeans. He would find, on hearing it, that he had a second question. The first one, though, was not yet finished. After the question of how long, on his stylus, came the indictment in chapter 1, verse 4. Therefore the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice is perverted. That single verse is what made the opening cry possible. The Lord's silence had not been generic. It was the silence over a specific corruption. The prophet was looking at courts that had stopped delivering verdicts, magistrates whose decisions ran in favor of whoever had paid most recently, land claims forced through by the strong against the weak, widows and resident foreigners, the categories that the Hebrew Bible always lists together as the most exposed members of any society, losing what little they had. The Hebrew word translated perverted in his verse, me'ukal, means literally twisted, bent, made crooked. Justice was not absent. Justice was crooked. It came out, but it came out warped. In the Judah of Jehoiakim, this was not theory. Royal courts ruled in favor of whoever was nearest the throne. Land was taken from smallholders by faction and forced sale. Officials extracted labor and tribute for palace construction without regard to the protections the Torah laid down for the poor and the resident foreigner. The prophet was not exaggerating when he said the law was paralyzed. He was describing what any observer in Jerusalem would have seen by walking down to the city gate where judgments were given. That was the world the prophet had been asking the Lord to see. And it was while he was waiting for the answer, perhaps in the same moment of writing, perhaps days or weeks later, that the answer came. Chapter 1, verse 5 opens it. Look at the nations and watch, and be utterly amazed. For I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe. even if you were told. The verb in Hebrew is in the second person plural. The Lord is not speaking to the prophet alone. The address widens. It is to the kingdom. It is to the eventual readers of the scroll. And the thing the Lord says they would not believe is named, in the next verse, by its own name. Verse 6, I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. That was the answer. What made it hard to take was not the violence. Hebrew prophets had always carried hard messages, and the warning of foreign destruction had been on the table since at least Amos. What made it hard was the identity of the agent. The Lord was raising up a nation outside the covenant, idolatrous, ruthless. In the prophet's own coming description, guilty. To the prophet's eye, that was theological reversal at the deepest level. The covenant had been an arrangement between the Lord and his people. Now the Lord was bringing in a third party. And the third party he had chosen made no claim to be on his side. What followed on the page in verses 7 through 11 was a description that reads like a clinical battlefield report. The prophet writes as if dictating what he can already see on the horizon. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swooping to devour. They all come intent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They mock kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities. By building earthen ramps, they capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty people, whose own strength is their God. The images are not metaphor. They are observation. Babylonian cavalry was, in fact, faster than the cavalry of any other army then operating in the region. Babylonian engineers, in fact, built earthen ramps against city walls with a speed and discipline that the Assyrian engineers had pioneered and the Babylonians had refined. The eagle swooping to devour was not poetic exaggeration. It was the speed at which Nebuchadnezzar's forward columns moved. And the closing line of the description, guilty people whose own strength is their God, is not a moral aside. It is the specific theological problem the prophet is about to bring up. This is where the second question came. It is in chapter 1, verses 12 to 17. The prophet does not soften it. He addresses the Lord directly, and the address is built like a legal brief, beginning with what the prophet still affirms, and pivoting into what he cannot reconcile. Verse 12, Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. That is not a denial. It is a confession. The prophet still calls the Lord my rock. He still acknowledges that the Lord has the authority to use the Babylonians. But then comes the question that the prophets of Israel, before and after Habakkuk, had circled around without quite saying it this plainly. Verse 13, Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? There is the second question in the open, undefended. A holy God, in the prophet's understanding, ought not to be able even to look at evil. And yet he was not just looking. He was recruiting. He was calling up the Babylonians to do what no holy one should be willing to use. This is the moral problem that in Hebrew thought distinguished the divine from any other being. The Lord's holiness was not a stylistic preference. It was an attribute the prophet was now asking the Lord to honor against itself. Could the Holy One be holy and at the same time use the unholy as his instrument? The book of Habakkuk does not pretend the question is easy. It puts the question on the page and stops. The verses that follow, 14 through 17, work out the scandal in image after image. The Babylonians, the prophet says, fish people out of the sea like men with nets, dragging up the helpless in their hooks. They sacrifice to their nets, because by their nets they live in luxury. And they are never satisfied. They drag in another netful and another, destroying nations without mercy. The image was, in fact, a quotation back. The Babylonians of the 7th century did glorify their military success in just these terms. Cuneiform inscriptions from the period describe royal hunts and royal conquests in nearly the same vocabulary. The king as the great fisherman, the conquered peoples as the fish, the net as the standing instrument of empire. The prophet of Habakkuk had heard the propaganda. He turned the propaganda's own image back as an indictment. The Babylonians were the fishermen sacrificing to their nets. They were the empire that worshipped the means of its own conquest. This was, in fact, an old motif in Mesopotamian royal iconography. As far back as the stele of the vultures, which dates to the middle of the 3rd millennium before Christ, kings of Sumer had been depicted with nets in which the bodies of conquered enemies were entangled. By the 7th century, the imagery had been recycled for half a dozen royal traditions. The prophet of Habakkuk was quoting back something the Babylonians themselves would have recognized. The end of the chapter does not resolve. There is no answer this time. The prophet has put his second question on the page, and the page is silent. What the chapter does at its close is technically unusual. Most prophetic books resolve a complaint by pivoting to a sermon, a vision, or a word of comfort. Habakkuk does not pivot. He stops. Verse 17 ends with a question, and no verse after it answers. The prophet has reached the end of what he can say without a reply from on high. The reply does not come, and the prophet, having put both questions before the Lord, and received an answer to one but not the other, said nothing more. He went somewhere higher, and there he waited. Chapter 2, verse 1 is what he wrote next. I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me, and what answer I am to give to this complaint. The image is precise. The ramparts of an ancient Near Eastern city were the elevated walkway built into the top of the wall, where sentinels stood to watch the horizon for approaching armies. The Hebrew verb for stand at my watch, shamar, is the same verb used for the temple guard, the night watch, the soldier on a perimeter. He had taken the posture of a sentinel, excavated city walls from the period. At Lachish, at Tel Beersheba, at the city of David in Jerusalem, show the watchtower as a structural feature built into the wall itself, with stairs running up from the inside and a low parapet at the top. A sentinel stationed there could see kilometers across the surrounding country. The prophet, in his image, was placing himself at the empire-watching post of his own city. But the second clause of the verse is the one that gives the chapter its character. What answer I am to give to this complaint? He was not waiting to receive comfort. He was waiting to formulate a counter-argument. He fully intended to keep pressing the case. The watch on the ramparts was not the watch of a man preparing to submit. It was the watch of a man preparing to file his next motion. The reply, when it came, was different in tone from the first reply. Chapter 2, verse 2. Write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets so that a herald may run with it. tablets. In this context, mean wooden boards covered in wax. The standard medium for inscribing and posting public announcements in late 7th century Judah. The Lord's first instruction, after the prophet had asked the deepest theological question of the entire book, was administrative. Write it down, make it readable at a glance, get it ready for distribution. Verse 3 follows, "For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay." There is a paradox in those two sentences, and the prophet leaves it on the page. The revelation will linger. The revelation will not delay. Both at once. The Hebrew verb for linger is doubled, intensifying the sense of waiting. The verb for not delay is the standard opposite. The point is not timing in the linear sense. The point is that what the Lord has said will arrive at exactly the time it was meant to arrive, and any human sense that it is overdue is an illusion of the human position inside the wait. The Hebrew word for appointed time, mode, is the same word the Torah uses for the appointed seasons of the religious calendar, the festivals the Lord himself had set. To say that the revelation awaits a mode is to say that this is not chaos. The Lord has scheduled it. The waiting is not abandonment. The waiting is calendar. Then comes the verse that, more than any other in the prophets, would be quoted, contested, and carried forward through the centuries that follow. Chapter 2, verse 4. "See, the enemy is puffed up. His desires are not upright, but the righteous person will live by his faithfulness." Two halves. The enemy, the Babylonian in the immediate context, but also more broadly, any human power that swells against the Lord, is puffed up. His desires are not upright. He has lost the alignment between what he wants and what is right. Against him, in the second half of the verse, stands the tzaddik, the righteous person, and the tzaddik does not survive by his own strength. He survives by emunah, a Hebrew word that translates as faith or faithfulness, but carries in its root the idea of standing firm, the same root that gives English the word amen. The righteous person is the one who stays steady, who keeps fidelity to the covenant, who, in the face of an empire swelling on the horizon, does not stop trusting the one who allowed the empire to rise. That is what the verse meant in 600 before Christ, on a wall in Jerusalem, written on a wax tablet that a herald could carry running. It was a survival instruction for a kingdom about to be invaded. The just person, the prophet was being told, would not be saved by political maneuver, would not be saved by alliance with Egypt, would not be saved even by the renewed covenant of the most thoroughgoing reform that Southern Kingdom had ever undertaken. He would be saved by remaining faithful when faith was the only thing remaining. The grammatical link between the two halves of the verse is the contrast between two ways of remaining alive in a world about to fall. The puffed up has only his swelling, which the prophet has just diagnosed as the very thing the Babylonians worship. Their own strength as their God. The faithful one has emunah. He keeps standing because he keeps trusting. The verse is not, in 600 before Christ, abstract theology. It is the practical instruction for what to do when an empire is at the gate. After verse 4, the prophet's writing turns outward against the Babylonians themselves. The rest of chapter 2 is built as a sequence of 5 woes. Formal indictments, each beginning with the Hebrew interjection hoi, the prophet's cry of accusation, translated into English as woe. 5 woes is a deliberate count. The prophets used this rhetorical pattern. Isaiah, in his own chapter 5, had built 6 woes against Judah's elite. Habakkuk's 5 woes against Babylon are the same form redirected. The accusations the prophets had once turned inward against their own kingdom are now turned outward against the empire being raised against it. The pattern would not have been lost on the prophet's first readers. The first, verses 6 to 8, is the woe of plunder. Woe to the one who piles up stolen goods, who has made himself wealthy by extortion. The accumulated peoples will turn on him. The verse is built like a creditor's notice. The debt is being called. The second, verses 9 to 11, is the woe of greed in construction. Woe to the one who builds his house with unjust gain, hoping by elevation to escape the reach of disaster. The very stones of the building, the prophet says, will cry out, and the wooden beams will echo back. The image of inanimate building materials accusing their builder is one of the most haunting in Hebrew. Prophecy, the third, verses 12 to 14, is the woe of bloodshed. Woe to the one who builds a city with blood and establishes a town with crime. The work of all such building, the prophet says, becomes fuel for fire. And then comes the line that has been carried into hymns and prayers across 30 centuries. Verse 14, "For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." Touché. Fourth, verses 15 to 17, is the woe of intoxication and shame. Woe to the one who gives drink to his neighbors, pouring it from a wineskin until they are drunk, in order to gaze on their nakedness, the Babylonian habit of humiliating conquered peoples. Paraded naked before victory crowds, displayed in foreign temples, is being called by its name, and the prophet promises that the cup of the Lord's right hand is coming around to the one who poured. The fifth, verses 18 to 19, is the woe of idolatry. Woe to the one who says to a piece of wood, "Come to life," or to a piece of stone, "Wake up." The image cannot save. The image cannot speak. The image is silent. There is a movement in the close of the chapter that the woes set up. The idols of Babylon are silent because they are dead. The image is wood. The image is stone. The breath the Maker calls for is breath that will not come. And then in verse 20, the chapter pivots into a single line that closes everything before it. "The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him." After the 5 woes, after the long catalogue of human swelling and human failing, the chapter ends in silence. The Lord is where he has always been. The earth, including the prophet on his ramparts, has nothing more to say. What the prophet writes next does not break the silence with words. It breaks the silence with song. The song begins with a heading. Chapter 3, verse 1, a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet on Shigionoth. The word Shigionoth is a musical term. Its exact meaning is uncertain. It appears as a title in only one other place in the Hebrew Bible, at the head of Psalm 7, but the context suggests an ecstatic or impassioned mode. The chapter is meant to be sung. It carries Selah markers at 3 points within it, which mark musical pauses or shifts in performance, and it ends in verse 19 with a notation for the director of music on my stringed instruments. Chapter 3 is structurally a psalm. The prophet has finished arguing and has begun to sing. The 3 Selahs in the chapter fall at verse 3, verse 9 and verse 13. Read as musical markers. They divide the song into 4 sections: the petition with which it opens, the appearing from the south, the cosmic combat, and the deliverance, each pause inviting the singers to absorb what has just been said before the next. Movement begins. The chapter is not a poem laid out for reading. It is a piece of liturgy meant to be performed. The opening petition, verse 2, is short and directional. Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds, Lord. Repeat them in our day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. Two things in that verse matter for what is about to come. First, the prophet asks the Lord to repeat his ancient deeds. The saving acts the prophet has heard of, the deliverance from Egypt, the parting of the sea, the descent on Sinai, the conquest under Joshua. He is asking the Lord to do in his own day what the Lord did at the founding of the nation. Second, in wrath, remember mercy. The wrath has already been announced. What the prophet now asks is that, as the Lord deals out the wrath he has promised, mercy not be forgotten in it. Then the song opens. Verse 3. God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. His glory covered the heavens, and his praise filled the earth. The geography is significant. Teman is in Edom, the land south of Judah. Mount Paran is in the desert region southwest of Edom, on the route to Sinai. In the most ancient layers of Israelite poetry, the Lord's home is in the south. Deuteronomy 33, the blessing of Moses, opens with, "The Lord came from Sinai and dawned over them from Seir. He shone forth from Mount Paran." Judges 5, the Song of Deborah, says, "When you, Lord, went out from Seir, when you marched from the land of Edom, the earth shook." These three passages, Habakkuk 3, Deuteronomy 33, and Judges 5, share more than imagery. They share archaic Hebrew vocabulary, rhythmic patterns, and a vision of the Lord as a warrior coming up from the south. They are widely held to be among the oldest poetry preserved in the Hebrew Bible, and the geography was not only a literary tradition. In the prophet's own time, it was still a cultic identification. Inscriptions found in the late 20th century at Kuntilet Ajrud, a small caravan station in the northern Sinai, dating to the 9th or 8th century before Christ, refer in writing to YHWH of Teman as a specific cultic name, a way of naming the Lord by the southern region from which the older songs said he came. The image of the Lord coming from Teman was, therefore, not poetic flourish. It was a name with weight. Francis Anderson, in his Anchor Bible commentary on Habakkuk, argues that chapter 3 may itself preserve a poem older than the rest of the book. That the prophet, in his moment of confrontation with the Lord over the question of the Babylonians, reached back into the deep memory of the kingdom's hymnic tradition and pulled out, or composed in deliberate imitation of, the most archaic style available. The chapter does not feel like the prophet inventing a new song for a new crisis. It feels like the prophet remembering an old song and putting it under his own moment. The theophany itself is total. His splendor was like the sunrise. Rays flashed from his hand. Plague went before him. Pestilence followed his steps. He stood and shook the earth. He looked and made the nations tremble. The ancient mountains crumbled. The tents of Cushan, the people of the Sinai region, were in distress. The dwellings of Midian, the desert peoples east of the Red Sea, were in anguish. The Lord was on the move, coming up from the south, and the closest nations to him were the ones who saw him first and fell silent. Then, in verse 8, the imagery shifts from the terrestrial to the cosmic. Were you angry with the rivers, Lord? Was your wrath against the streams? Did you rage against the sea when you rode your horses and your chariots to victory? To readers in the Asia, ancient Near East, those questions had a specific resonance. The combat between a god and the sea was one of the foundational narratives of the entire region. The texts found at Ras Shamra on the Syrian coast, when they were discovered in 1928 and translated in the decades afterward, gave the modern world an extensive literature in Ugaritic, an early Canaanite language. Among the most important documents in those tablets is the Baal cycle, in which the storm god Baal does battle with Yam, literally sea, and defeats him to claim kingship over the gods. The same motif appears in older Mesopotamian myth, where the god Marduk slays the chaos serpent Tiamat, and from her body fashions the world, and in Egyptian myth, where the sun god Ra fights the serpent Apep nightly to keep the world from collapsing into the dark. Habakkuk's questions in verse 8 are, in this light, polemical. The prophet asks if the Lord's anger was against the sea, and the implicit answer is no. The Lord did not need to fight the sea, because the sea had no real power against him. But the imagery of the warrior god subduing chaos, breaking the deep, splitting the earth with rivers, calling lightning as his arrows, treading the great waters underfoot. That imagery is identical to the Canaanite imagery, and the prophet uses it precisely. He uses it because in his moment, with the Babylonian army coming, he needs to call on the Lord as the warrior who can do what the imagery says. In the Baal cycle of the Ras Shamra texts, the climactic combat is described in lines that, in translation, read like a fragment of Habakkuk himself. Baal smites Yam. The skies burn. The deep roars. Yam is broken and falls. Baal scatters him. The vocabulary of Habakkuk 3, the rivers, the deep, the sea, the rising waters, the warrior with bow and arrows in his chariot, is the same vocabulary that the Canaanite combat myth had, used for centuries. The difference is that in the prophet's poem, the combat is the Lord's, not Baal's, and the deliverance is for Israel, not for Canaan. The prophet has taken the most ancient warrior god song available in the Levant and put it in the right hands. The cosmic combat that follows is rendered in single short images. The earth split by rivers, the mountains writhing, the deep roaring and lifting its waves, sun and moon standing still in the heavens. The Lord's flying arrows, his flashing spear. He strides through the earth in wrath. He threshes the nations, and the climax in verse 13 names the purpose. You came out to deliver your people, to save your anointed one. The Lord, the prophet sings, was on the move not to crush wholesale, but to save. The instrument was wrath, but the object of the wrath was the empire that crushed the people, and the object of the rescue was the people themselves. And then in verse 16 the song stops, and the prophet is left alone with what he has just sung. I heard and my heart pounded, my lips quivered at the sound, decay crept into my bones, and my legs trembled. This is the body of the prophet, describing what it is like to have stood inside the theophany he had just put on the page. The vision had answered nothing. In one sense, the Babylonians were still coming, but it had answered something else. The Lord was not absent. The Lord was a warrior who had come up from the south once and would come again. And then, in the same verse, comes the sentence that holds the prophet in place between what he saw and what he had not yet been spared. Yet I will wait patiently for the day of calamity to come on the nation invading us. What follows the vow to wait is the closing of the entire book. Verse 17 of chapter 3. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines. Though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls. 6 failures, one after another. The figs that ripened first in the agricultural year. The grapes that came in at harvest. The olives the kingdom depended on for oil and lamp fuel. The grain fields, the sheep, the cattle. If all 6 of them fail in the same year, what the prophet is describing is total famine. It is the reasonable forecast of what an invasion was about to do to a small agricultural kingdom. The verse does not stop at the failures. It pivots in verse 18 on the word yet. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Saviour. This is the hinge of the entire book. The prophet has not been answered on the question that brought him to the watch. The Babylonians are still coming. The fig tree will not bud. And the prophet, having sung his theophany and named what he was about to lose, decides on the next thing he can decide. He decides to rejoice. Verse 19 closes the book. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to tread on the heights. And then, on a single line of musical notation, for the director of music, on my stringed instruments. The book that began with a complaint pressed against the silence of the Lord ends with a hymn handed to the temple choir. What happened next, the prophet did not live to see in detail. He disappears from the historical record after his book. Where he died, we do not know. Whether he saw the events he had foreseen, we cannot tell. But the book began moving on its own, in the world he had left, in 597 before Christ. Within a decade of when he had probably written, the army on the road from Babylon arrived at Jerusalem. The city was taken. The young king Jehoiakim and his court, 10,000 of the elite, were deported. In 587 before Christ, after a second rebellion, the Babylonians returned. The walls were broken down. The temple was burned. The Lord's house, the place from which the prophet had heard the silence, was reduced to rubble. Archaeology confirms the second siege in the burn layers across the city of David, in the so-called House of the Bully, where dozens of clay seal impressions bearing the names of officials of the last Judahite king were sealed in the ash, and in the cluster of letters known as the Lachish Ostraca, military correspondence, written on potsherds sent from outposts to Jerusalem as the Babylonian army closed in. The first warning of the prophet's book had been fulfilled to the letter, but the second movement of the book had also been a warning, and that warning had been against Babylon itself. In 539 before Christ, less than 50 years after the destruction of the temple, the Persian king Cyrus the Great marched on Babylon. The city, which had been the architectural advertisement of the New World Order, was taken almost without battle. The administrative document Cyrus left in the foundation of the recaptured Temple of Marduk, known to modern scholarship as the Cyrus Cylinder, now in the British Museum, describes the entry as a peaceful procession. Cyrus credits Marduk with handing him the city. The Babylonian dynasty that had risen with Nabopolassar fell, in 2 generations, to the next empire on the horizon. The book of Habakkuk had said it would happen. The 5 woes against the empire that piled up plunder, that built with bloodshed, that laughed at fortified cities, had named the end. By 539, the ending had arrived. Babylon, in turn, was carried off. About 400 years after that, in the desert south of Jericho, a small community settled in caves above a place now called Khirbet Qumran. Among the texts they copied and stored there, on scrolls now scattered across museums in Jerusalem, was a copy of Habakkuk paired with the most extensive commentary the community produced on any prophetic book. The Pesher Habakkuk, designated 1Q Pehab, recovered from Cave 1 in 1947. The Pesher reads the prophet as a contemporary. Where Habakkuk had written about the Babylonians, the Qumran commentator translates the threat into the Romans of his own day, whom the community called the Kittim. Where the prophet had decried the wicked within Judah, the commentator names a wicked priest within the Second Temple establishment of his own time. The verse that the prophet had written for a kingdom about to fall to a foreign empire was being read 4 centuries later as a verse for a community that believed itself to be living under foreign empire again, and in the Pesher's commentary on the central verse of Habakkuk's chapter 2, the line about the righteous, living by faith. The Qumran writer interprets it as referring to those who keep faith with the teacher of righteousness, the founding figure of the community. The verse had become, by then, a measure of inclusion within a particular school of reading. The book had not closed. About 100 years after the Pesher, in the city of Corinth, an apostle named Paul was writing a letter to the Christian community in Rome. He was working out, in the opening chapter of that letter, what he understood the gospel to be. And the verse he reached for, in chapter 1 verse 17 of his Romans, was the same verse the prophet had once been told to make plain on tablets so that a herald could carry it, running, Romans 1 verse 17. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. Paul quotes the verse in Greek, with the Greek words ekpisteos for what the Hebrew prophet had called emunah. He quotes the same verse again in Galatians chapter 3 verse 11. The author of the letter to the Hebrews, in chapter 10 verse 38, quotes it once more. 3 different first-century writers reach for the same Hebrew sentence in their Greek New Testament to say what they took the gospel to be. None of them re-explain it. They use it as if it had been there all along, waiting. Augustine, in the late 4th century, builds his doctrine of grace partly on Paul's reading of that verse. More than 1,000 years after Augustine, in a small cell in the tower of the Augustinian monastery in Wittenberg, an Augustinian friar named Martin Luther sat with the same passage. By his own later account, he had been wrestling for years with the question of how a man with a guilty conscience could ever stand before a holy God, reading and rereading Romans 1 verse 17, the meaning of the prophet's verse, that the righteous live by faith, broke open for him. He would later call it his tower experience. He felt, he said, that he had been born again, and that the gates of paradise had opened. John Calvin, in his commentary on Habakkuk, written in the next generation, takes the verse on its own terms within the prophet's book. He notes its function as the answer the Lord had given to the second question. He works out the difference between the prophet's emunah, which he takes as steadfast trust, and a thinner contemporary understanding of faith as mere assent. The verse, in Calvin's reading, asks for fidelity under fire. Exactly the fidelity the prophet had shown when he closed his book with the rejoicing in the failed harvest. 3 Hebrew words, written on a wax-covered tablet on a wall in Jerusalem in 600 before Christ. Those 3 words crossed the destruction of the temple, the rise and fall of 2 empires, the 400 years of waiting at Qumran, the apostolic letter writing in Corinth, the doctrinal struggle of Augustine, and the cell of an Augustinian friar in a German tower. They did not stop moving, and the prophet had not lived to see any of it. He had only put the verse down and then closed his book with a song about a fig tree that did not bud, about rejoicing in the Lord even when the harvest had failed, and a line about the heights, where his feet would be made like the feet of a deer. Whatever else the prophet of Habakkuk could not see, he had seen on his ramparts the figure of a man standing in the wind on a high place above his own destruction, and what he had seen was enough